So you've got the itch and you've decided it's time to start fish keeping, but you don't know where to start. Well, don't worry, because today I'm going to be talking about setting up your first fish tank. There's a ton of information out there about fish keeping, and this video is meant to help ease you into it without getting you too overwhelmed. Future videos will dive more deeply into complex subjects, but this one will get you going. The first thing we need to consider before setting up the tank is what makes a good fish tank. The answer is going to be unique for every individual. My thought is this: begin with the end in mind. What do you want to do with your fish tank? Now that you have a picture of what you want to do with your first fish tank, the first thing we need to consider is the tank itself. How big of a fish tank do we need? Well, that's going to depend on your goals. If you want to keep big fish or you want to have a lot of fish, you're going to need a bigger tank. If you're thinking small fish or just a few, maybe a smaller tank would be just fine. I will caution, one of the mistakes that beginners make is they go for a small fish tank thinking that it's going to be easier. Guys, I gotta tell you, a smaller fish tank is not easier. In fact, the opposite is true. The bigger you can go, the easier you're gonna have it. Not to state the obvious, but the bigger the fish tank, the more water it has in it. Because of this, things change much more slowly in the tank because the volume of water creates a more stable environment that is more resistant to change. Imagine you had a drop of red food coloring and you put it in a cup of water. Well, what's gonna happen to the water? It's gonna turn red, right? Well, now imagine you put that same drop of red food coloring into a swimming pool. Would you even notice? And that's kind of the idea behind having a larger fish tank. I say that the solution to pollution is dilution. When we have more water to dilute things like ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates, we don't have to worry about them as much because it's going to take a long time for those things to build up. In a little fish tank, we're going to see changes very rapidly, whether that be temperature, pH, or waste accumulation. So my recommendation would be to get the biggest fish tank that you think that you can reasonably accommodate. A good minimum size for beginners would be something like a 10-gallon tank, maybe a 20 or even a 55. These are standard tank sizes, which are relatively reasonably priced and pretty easy to take care of and set up. Anything smaller than a 10-gallon is probably going to be more difficult, and you may not get what you want out of that fish tank. Your stock levels are going to be limited, and the types of fish that you can have is also going to be limited. Waste is going to accumulate much faster in that small tank as well. One last thing to consider when selecting a tank is where you're planning to put it. And I'm not just talking about living room versus bedroom here. Fish tanks are heavy. Fresh water weighs about 8.34 pounds per gallon. And since we're adding rocks and gravel and the weight of the tank itself, I say a good estimate for the weight of a fish tank is about 10 pounds per gallon. And that makes the math easy too. So a 10-gallon tank is about 100 pounds. Something bigger like a 55 is going to be over 500 pounds. A stand designed for aquariums is going to be recommended and even required for most tank warranties. Remember that your countertops, that IKEA table, and great-grandma's heirloom dresser weren't designed with your 500-pound fish tank in mind. So once we've decided what we want to do with the tank, we've selected a size and figured out where it's going to be important that we come up with what equipment we need for this tank to be successful. These are things like lights, heaters, and filters. Now there's a myriad of different products out there that you can choose from, and it's going to vary on what your budget is, what you want to do with the tank, and how much space you have for the equipment. But these are what you're going to need to get started. So let's talk about filters. The filter is what's going to keep your water clean. It will clean out particles in the water, and it's going to be the best place for the beneficial bacteria to perform their job of removing harmful waste from the water. There's many different types of filters, but I'm going to concentrate on the three most common. Those are hang-on-back, sponge, and canister filters. One of the more common filters, and probably the one that you think of whenever I say filter, is the hang-on-back filter. What they do is they sit on the back of the tank, they suck water in and push it through the filter. It comes back out into the tank. These are simple filters to use, to maintain, and replacement parts are easy to find. Now for smaller tanks, a hang-on-back filter is probably a good choice. The second option is a sponge filter like what you see behind me. These ones are cheap, they're easy to set up, and easy to maintain. They're super simple, they have no moving parts. They're driven by air, so you connect an air pump to it, which will create bubbles in the tube above the sponge. That air moving through the tube sucks water through the sponge, and that's what's filtering your tank. It's easy, and there's even air pumps with backup batteries, so they'll keep running in the event of a power outage. The third common filter option is a canister filter. And while these are more expensive and more complicated, whenever we get into bigger tanks, the best option is oftentimes a canister filter. With canister filters, they're usually placed down below the tank, and hoses are used to get water into and out of the tank through the filter. The downside to these filters are going to be the price and the difficulty to set up. They're going to be much higher price than a hang-on back filter or a sponge filter, and the setup is a bit more involved, but the time and money invested is worth it. These filters are phenomenal. They work day in and day out and require very little maintenance in the long run. The next piece of equipment is the heater. Depending on what fish you've chosen, there's a good chance that you're going to need a heater. Goldfish, axolotls, and a handful of other fish want cold water, but most tropical fish are going to appreciate a temperature around 78 degrees, and I don't know about you, but that's too hot for my comfort. So we use a heater. Heaters are classified by their wattage. The smaller the tank, the lower the wattage. The bigger the tank, the higher the wattage. If you look on most packaging, it will tell you a recommended tank size for that heater. Choose a heater that's appropriate for your size of fish tank. On really big tanks, I'll even use multiple heaters. The last piece of equipment you'll need is a light. Now, mostly lights are for us humans to see the fish. They don't really serve much of a purpose in the tank unless you're going with plants. So live plants are going to require a full spectrum light. So if you're going the planted route, make sure you choose a light that says full spectrum or specifically says it is for plants. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen people have their plants die because they're using the little LED lights from the kit they got. It just won't do, unfortunately. A plant light is probably going to be a little bit more expensive, but trust me, it's worth it. Plants are expensive, and it's no fun watching them melt away because the light in the tank is no good for them. All right, so we've figured out the equipment. Let's get on to the fun part. What goes in the tank? The first thing to consider is the substrate. The substrate is whatever goes in the bottom of the tank, whether that be gravel, sand, dirt, a nutrient-rich substrate that's created for plants. It's all going to depend on what you find aesthetically appealing and what you want to do with the tank. If this is a fish-only tank, then we can go with pretty much whatever we want. If it's going to be a planted tank, then I highly recommend going with a nutrient-rich soil or substrate. Whatever we decide we want to do for the substrate, I want to make sure that we get enough. The general guideline is about a pound of substrate per gallon of tank. So if you have a 10-gallon tank, you probably need about 10 pounds of substrate. If you have a 20, so on and so forth. There are ways to calculate this, and it's going to vary on the depth that you want, but as a general guideline, about a pound per gallon is a good starting point. When we put the substrate in the tank, I like to see between 1 inch to 2 inches, and this is going to vary depending on if you're going planted or not. For a planted tank, I like to go deeper. It depends on what kind of plants you want, but most root feeders are going to appreciate 2 to 3 inches of substrate, and it's going to be much easier to plant them in a deeper substrate. Our next consideration is going to be what type of decorations we want in the tank. Even if you get a kit that's going to come with the light, the heater, and the filter, it's not going to come with decorations. There's an infinite number of ways that you can scape a tank, and every tank is going to be different. Do what makes you happy. So maybe you like driftwood and rocks for your planted tank. It's a great choice. Maybe you like the castle or the shipwreck. They're awesome too. Whatever you find visually appealing. It's your tank, do what you want to do with it. The main thing is that you come up with a tank that you like to look at. If you decide you want to go the route of live plants, which I think is a great idea because they really help with water quality, you're going to want to consider what type of plants you want to get into. Now, I won't go into too great detail right now, but I highly recommend easy plants to start with. You can get into more complicated things as you go along. Things like Java fern, Anubias, and mosses are really easy to start with, and they're going to have a great success rate. So now that we've got our substrate and our decorations and equipment, it's time to get the tank set up. Since all the equipment varies, you'll want to read the instructions on everything and follow the setup guides. One thing I will say on equipment, don't plug in heaters or filters until they're in the water. Heaters will melt and the glass will explode and pumps will burn up if you run them when they're dry. It should be stated on the instructions, just don't forget. Before anything goes in the tank, rinse it with cold water. Just make this a habit. That cool piece of driftwood or that pirate ship that has been sitting on a shelf collecting dust before you purchased it, you don't want all that in your tank. Now, substrates are going to need to be rinsed as well. Some are easier than others. Gravel is easier. Use a colander or a sieve and run water over it. Sand and plant substrates are more difficult and usually take more time. I usually take them outside with a bucket and use a garden hose. The main thing is to take your time and get them as clean as possible without agitating them too much, just so they don't break up. Just get them as clean as you can so the tank doesn't get cloudy when you add water. And once rinsed, you can put that substrate and the decorations in the tank. After everything is in the place, it's time to fill the tank with water. Now this is an important step. Where are we going to get our water? Personally, I prefer to just use dechlorinated tap water. It's always there, it's super cheap, and relatively consistent. Just remember that most tap water has chlorine or chloramine in it, and that's why we always use a water conditioner or dechlorinator. This is important because it's what actually takes the chlorine out of the water and makes it safe for fish. If we skip this crucial step, we're going to kill our bacteria, we're going to kill our fish, and our plants aren't going to like it. And we're just going to have a bad time. This is important. Every time we put water in the tank, we have to use water dechlorinator. Once we have the fish tank filled with that dechlorinated water, we're going to add bacteria to get things started. Now, the nitrogen cycle is a little bit more complex than what I want to get into in this video, so we're going to save that one for a different time. But the main thing is we need to get bacteria started in the tank so that we can start working on the ammonia that the fish produces waste. Without this beneficial bacteria, we're going to have problems. Once we have the bacteria in the tank, we have to add an ammonia source. So this is the consideration. Do we do a fish in cycle or do we do a fishless cycle? Both methods are going to take time, and that's the number one thing we need to consider when we're starting this hobby. Everything takes time. It's going to take a while. Whether you do a fish in cycle or the fishless cycle, expect a couple of weeks for things to settle down. If we're going to use fish, we need to use a very hardy species that can tolerate the less than ideal water conditions that we're going to have in the tank. It's also going to be up to us to make sure that they don't suffer while we're doing this. Test your water. Test your water. We have to test our water. The ammonia in the tank has to be there, but we also don't want it to get to a level that's going to harm the fish. That's why I always recommend that a new fish keeper has at least an ammonia test on hand. We want to make sure that the water doesn't get too dirty for the fish. If the levels of ammonia get too high, just do a water change and keep testing. After we've had our fish in the tank, or we've been adding our ammonia, and we've waited, we're going to eventually see that the water is okay to have fish by testing. We are looking for no ammonia, no nitrites, and nitrates that are slowly accumulating. Again, that's for another video. So once we've tested the water and made sure that it's safe for fish, we can start slowly adding more fish. It's going to depend on the size of the tank as to how many you can add at a time, but generally if you're only adding 1, 2, or 3 at a time, and they're small fish or they're relatively small to the size of your tank, it's going to be just fine. As we go forward, we're going to be testing our water and we're going to be making sure that our levels are correct. Now I'll explain more of that in a different video, but essentially you want to keep your levels low enough that the fish are going to be happy and healthy. Keep those in check by doing water changes. In general, it's not going to hurt to do a water change as long as we're using dechlorinated water and our temperatures are relatively the same. A 15 to 20% water change every week is recommended for at least the first month or two. This will ensure that the waste doesn't build up to dangerous levels. Congratulations! You now have an operational fish tank. Please stay tuned as this is just the first video in a series for beginner aquarists. In the next video, we're going to do a deeper dive into the nitrogen cycle and what it means for our tanks. Please comment down below if you have any questions or suggestions for future content. Thank you for liking and subscribing. We'll see you next time.